4 decades. That period in the front line has encompassed two of the most controversial figures of that era, President Richard Nixon and President Donald Trump. Roger Stone, a compelling figure in his own right, not a man who's any stranger to controversy, it would be fair to say, once told The New Yorker upon moving to Miami, "It's a sunny place for shady people, I'll fit right in." I hope that was an accurate quote.
That is.
Nice to meet you.
Little self-deprecating humor there.
Welcome to the Hill.
Happy to be here.
So let's start with a simple question. You've known President Trump for about 4 decades?
40 years.
Yeah. What makes him tick?
Well, the most amazing thing about him, I think, is that he is a billionaire, but he's not an elitist. There's nothing snobby or formal or stiff about Donald Trump. He's a regular guy. He likes a good cheeseburger. He is a homebody. He's not somebody who, even when he wasn't in politics, was out on the party circuit. He's very approachable. He can talk to anybody, no matter where they are in the strata of life, whether it's a doorman or a waitress or a cab driver, as easily as he can talk to a Fortune 500 executive. He has a wicked sense of humor. He's fun to be with. He's fun to hang out with. He's fun to travel with. And I think he was a happy warrior through this whole campaign. You can see that he was having the time of his life, that he loved the rallies. And the bigger the turnout, the more he liked it. I think he drew strength from the people. Contrast that with his opponent, who I think was closeted, cosseted, kind of isolated, and not really clear that she likes people.
You made the point about him being a regular person despite his wealth. How much did that sort of cultural aspect, or the fact that he seemed a familiar figure to people, how much did that play into his victory, in your opinion?
Well, I think just the fact that he was universally known to start with, it was an enormous advantage, bolstered by 15 seasons of The Apprentice. He was a household word. So the other candidates in the race, say Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, while you and I know who they are because we're interested in politics, the average citizen had no idea who these people were. I would say in both cases, a majority of Americans were unfamiliar with them or their records. Trump had no such problem. The instant he showed up, everyone knew exactly who he was, and he could move right to his policy prescriptions and his platform. He didn't have to first introduce himself and explain what he'd already accomplished.
What does the media in general get wrong about him, personality-wise, and not politics, but if you from your experience, what do you see of him that is not reflected in media coverage of him?
Well, let's talk about the politics first. He's not an ideologue. He's a populist. He's a populist with conservative leanings, but he's not a dogmatic right-winger in any way. He's, in fact, very much like Nixon, he's a pragmatist, meaning he's interested in what will work. He doesn't look at issues one by one and say, well, what's the conservative position or what's the neocon position? He decides where he stands on individual issues, and then it's up to the media to determine what he is. He's not a neocon. He's not an isolationist. I guess he's a non-interventionist, but it's not nearly as Machiavellian or as thought out as some in the media think it is. He just, what you see is what you get.
Right, and that's the combative person that we see, you refer to him as sort of in tune with the common person.
Yeah, look, Franklin Roosevelt did very well among blue-collar voters. John Kennedy did very well among blue-collar voters. These were both wealthy, upper-crust individuals, but they had the common touch.
Sure.
I think Trump has the common touch. And the idea that he's some kind of a rigid ideologue or a caveman, it's just not the real Donald Trump.
If, as you say, one of his assets is that he does what works, a lot of people believe that his administration has got off to a pretty rocky start in these first few weeks. You share that view to any extent?
I think it has been mixed. In terms of fulfilling his agenda, I think he's been bold in terms of his executive orders. I think you're going to see more of that. I do think that's what the voters care about. I definitely think it's what his constituency cares about, his coalition. I view all these other, issues regarding his Twitter feed and so on, and whether he wears a bathrobe in the family quarters at night.
Sure.
I don't think the voters care about any of that.
But-
It's so much side noise.
But is it problematic that people close to him are telling reporters about the bathrobe or things of that
Yes,
nature?
I think it's very problematic. Look, I understand leaking. Leaking is an art form here in Washington, D.C., and it has its place. The strategic leak can be used politically to advance one's goals. But in this case, you have White House staffers who are leaking in a way that discredits and brings dishonor to the president. That's really disloyal. It really is contemptible. When you have White House staffers saying the president is like a clueless child, Washington Post piece, I think, that's beneath contempt. But this is the problem. When you people your administration, particularly your White House, with people who weren't for you, who didn't support you for the nomination, didn't support you until you were the nominee, and in some cases still didn't support you, when you're hiring party regulars for jobs that Trump loyalists could fill, I think you're inviting the problem.
Many people would see those kind of words as a jab at people like Reince Priebus and Sean Spicer. Is that a fair reading?
So be it.
Well, you are known for your sartorial elegance. Mr. Spicer's suits became a subject of discussion the other day. What do you think of that?
Let's put it this way. Every January 1st, I publish a list of the best and worst dressed people in the world. This is a custom and a tradition that I picked up from Mr. Blackwell, who was a Hollywood designer and kind of an arbiter of fashion beginning in the 30s until he died, some 15 years ago. So I picked up this tradition. It's called Mr. Stone's International Best and Worst Dressed List. I'm now in my 11th year. Gets nice pickup. The New York Post usually runs it and so on. Put it to you this way. Mr. Spicer is in no danger of being on the best dressed list anytime soon.
Is he in any danger of being the worst dressed, or is that giving away a
Well,
trade secret?
he does seem to be upping his game. It's gotten a little better. But again, was there no Trump loyalist with vast experience in dealing with the media who could have filled that job? I believe that there was.
Well, that does get to the more serious point. We're already seeing some reports about possible staff shake-ups in the White House. Do you think that would be beneficial?
Well, I saw that Chris Ruddy, who's a friend of mine, said that he thought that the chief of staff, Reince Priebus, was in over his head, and that has caused quite a bit of coverage today. Only the president knows. But I think at the end of the day, he's going to have to make some adjustments down the road because there is some evidence that the current setup is not working. It just seems to me that your ambassadors, your White House staff, your key administration figures should be Trump supporters. There are qualified people who would like those jobs, and at the moment they seem to be being passed over for party regulars whose loyalty is to the party rather than to the president.
And are you suggesting, or do you believe that that is linked to the amount of leaking that's going on, that people have divided loyalties in that respect?
Well, I think the leaking of it is a manifestation of this decision making. And I hope for the sake of the president that it stops.
Tell us a little bit more. You talk about it in your book, and of course we should say Roger's new book, The Making of the President 2016, out now in all good bookstores and online. In terms of your first dealings with Donald Trump as he was, what were your impressions?
Well, I met him in 1979 when I was sent to New York to organize the Reagan campaign. And I was immediately taken by how affable he is, how easygoing, how easy it was to talk to him. In our very first conversation, there was nothing stilted about it. I said, it's a great honor to meet you, Mr. Trump. He said, please call me Donald. And I've called him Donald since that time. When I spoke to him after the election, I said, well, congratulations, Mr. President. He said, please call me Donald. So he's an unassuming, approachable guy. He's eminently likable. My session with him was very short but very intense. I laid out how Ronald Reagan could become president. He asked me a lot of tough questions. He asked probing questions. Interestingly, always cutting back to this one. What's your path to 270 electoral votes? Even then, he said, tell me, assuming your man carries California, which Reagan did, show me how you get to 270. And in every conversation I think I had with him about the 1980 election, which was often because he's a junkie, he follows politics the way he follows sports, he's intensely interested in it, and he always wanted the inside skinny on the ongoing presidential campaign, the latest polls, latest developments. He was always fixated on how you get to 270. So he understood the game before he joined it, and I suspect he asked it his subsequent campaign managers the same question.
What, I mean, obviously he did get to 270 against many people's expectations this past fall. You have a very loyal view of him. Other people obviously argue that he won through demagoguery, through various, less than admirable traits by appealing to the baser instincts of the electorate. You say
they
to
said
that?
They said that about Lincoln too. So
right. But what do you think? You write in the book about the idea that he appealed to forgotten people by his manner.
Yeah, I think very much like Nixon, he recognized that there was a silent majority out there of people who don't demonstrate, who aren't protesting, who pay their taxes, who go to work, who go to school, who go to church, but they don't complain. And I think he tapped into that in a way that, frankly, Mitt Romney, John McCain, and in some instances George W. Bush were unable to do. Take the microcosm of Pennsylvania. The city of Philadelphia has become so democratic that you virtually can't carry that state in a presidential race because there's no way to overcome the Democratic margin in the city. The collar counties around Philadelphia used to offset some of the margin, used to be reliably Republican. They are no longer. So Trump was able to carry Pennsylvania by overperforming among white Democratic Union members in the western part of the state, the most Democratic part of the state. Trump is unique in that. In other words, Mitt Romney tried to do it, could not. McCain tried to do it and could not. So he, in the end, had a broader map. The ability to go into Wisconsin and Michigan and to double down in Pennsylvania really is what made the difference. I would also make the case to you that the fact that he got 3% more of the African American vote and that African American turnout was down anywhere between 4 and 6% overall is the difference between victory and defeat. 3% sounds de minimis in the abstract, but when you carry Michigan by 10,000 votes and you look at the results in the city of Detroit, black folks elected Donald Trump. There's no question about that.
Well, by not turning out for Hillary Clinton.
Or by voting in slightly greater numbers for him than they voted for Romney. Right. That 3% is the difference.
But do you not think it was a natural fall off from President Obama, who obviously has a particularly emotional appeal to black voters?
Yes, no question. But that's a good reason why Democratic pollsters and mainstream media pollsters should have calibrated that into their calculations, and they didn't. In most cases, they assumed African American turnout would be about the same as it had been under Obama, and they thought that she would approach his numbers. She did. It didn't, and she didn't.
Getting back to your own relationship with President Trump, I mean, you've had, I think it'd be fair to say, ups and downs in that relationship.
Yes.
Have you spoken with him recently?
I speak to him from time to time. I don't abuse the privilege. I only call if it's something important. He is good about returning my call. Beyond that, I'm not going to characterize the conversations because they will immediately end. The president is entitled to confidentiality. I have great affection for he and his family. I'm enormously proud of him. And in the end, I think I made the right decision to leave the campaign. I think I was of greater benefit from the outside than I ever could have been from the inside.
Why?
Well, because at 64 years old and having been through 9 presidential campaigns, I wasn't interested in having the things that I was going to write or say approved by someone else, someone with less experience. And secondarily, projects like the Danny Williams project or the Rape T-shirt project, where we used a crude and outrageous way to break through the mainstream media blockade of this issue, this blackout. As long as the media was going to continue to describe Bill Clinton's sexual assaults as indiscretions or infidelities, when I argue they were far more serious than that. It called for rogue tactics. It called for over the top. In the blur of cable TV and the internet and the 3 networks and the 2 cable networks, the American people have a glut of information. They have more information than they can possibly digest. And therefore, you have to be audacious to break through. You have to be interesting. You have to be outrageous. Bland does not do the trick.
And you enjoy a bit of outrageousness generally?
I enjoy what works. I'm interested in getting public attention for my ideas or projects. And if it's outrageousness is called for, fine.
Does it give you any pause, the idea of political culture becoming coarser, and any part that you might play in that?
They accused Martin Van Buren of wearing women's clothes. They accused Abraham Lincoln of fathering African American children out of wedlock. They accused Grover Cleveland of having an illegitimate daughter. They said that John Kennedy was going to move the Pope into the White House so he could run the country. This is not beanbag. This is a contact sport. It has always been a contact sport. If you think politics should be more genteel and more positive, try putting out a 36-page white paper on the environment and see how much coverage it gets. That would be none.
But is there anything that is not acceptable in terms of tactics in your
You
mind?
familiar with that rock and roll song, Dirty Laundry?
Sure, sure.
That's what the American people want to see. That's what attracts them. Mm-hmm. Sure, when you drive by the car crash, you're not supposed to look, but everybody does. It's human nature. So our politics appeals to the aspects of human nature. People like a fight. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be bored. As former President Nixon once said to me, the only thing worse in politics than being wrong is being boring. Donald Trump is never boring.
And that's a good point, because, I mean, Hillary Clinton arguably can be boring.
Sure.
And maybe I shouldn't say that.
No,
but anyway,
I think that's fair, because everything she said in the campaign was polled and focus grouped and roundtabled, and it came out as completely homogenized. It came out as groupthink. She had nothing really to say. In this book, I draw the parallel between the Truman-Dewey race and the Trump-Clinton race. And I think there are many parallels. Very much like Tom Dewey, Hillary Clinton was cold and aloof and overconfident and cosseted and didn't campaign because it was already in the bag. And Trump, like Truman, is audacious. Truman is really slinging heavy-duty attacks on the Republicans in the end. The Republicans are sticking a pitchfork in the back of every farmer in America. That's pretty hot rhetoric. And Trump steals a page from Truman. He mounts a superhuman physical effort to go into 8 states late that are up for grabs. Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, is in Chappaqua in her pajamas, looking at the swatches to pick out fabric for the curtains in her new White House office. An enormous mistake. She should have campaigned right to the bitter end, but she, like Dewey, was taking victory for granted.
That audacity of candidate Trump as he was worked in the election, but does that audacity carry risks whenever he is in the White House, if he's tweeting about one thing or another, diplomatic policy, the finer points of negotiation? If he's seen as unpredictable in the White House, is there more of a downside to that?
Well, unpredictability in negotiations is actually key. Nixon wrote extensively about the madman factor.
Right.
He would send Kissinger to see the Russians and say, this guy's nuts. He might push the button. You better agree to this immediately because he's out of control. Of course, none of that was ever the case, but it's a worthy diplomatic tactic. I don't think you want to be predictable. In fact, the only thing predictable about Donald Trump is that he's entirely unpredictable.
A couple of things that I think are important to raise. There have, obviously, and you write about this in the book, you believe that the allegations of Russian influence in the election were greatly overdone.
Total BS, as far as I know and as far as I am concerned. Look, I woke up here in Washington on Inauguration Day to read a New York Times page 1 piece that said the Central Intelligence Agency had uncovered email transmissions and financial transactions between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And the focus was on Paul Manafort, Roger Stone, and some guy named Carter Page, who frankly I've never heard of, and either has anybody else I know. I can't speak for Mr. Manafort, although he issued his own denial, and I don't know Mr. Page. I can speak for myself. There is no such thing. I had no Russian contacts, no Russian intermediaries, no Russian clients, no Russian money. It's a canard. It just doesn't exist.
There are no ties between you and
None whatsoever. And if the government finds that that is not true, then they should indict me right now. But if they won't, then they need to issue an apology, because frankly, this is getting tedious, very tedious. There is no even tenuous Russian tie. It's a falsehood.
You also think the broader issue of Russian influence in the election, you think that is, as you put it, BS. Do you believe that the Russians were involved in hacking emails?
First of all, the government and our intelligence agencies, all 17 of them who insist this happened, have still produced no proof. No Republican member of the House or Senate Intelligence Committee has seen proof. They've gotten an assessment. Assessment are words. It was their assessment that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They had no proof, and it wasn't true. So, did the Russians hack those involved in American politics? Probably. So did the Chinese. Most likely the Saudis, the Israelis, the North Koreans. I mean, the Chinese are the most adept hackers of them all. So I think it would be intelligent to presume that they were watching. But did the Russians in any way affect the outcome of this election? I see no evidence of it whatsoever.
Okay. In terms of things that did affect the outcome, one of the recurrent themes in the book is the idea that the mainstream media is, in your opinion, lacking in credibility, but that there are now various alternative channels to get one's message out.
Well,
Talk about that.
I guess what I'm saying is that I think it was in this election that we reached the tipping point. That based on technological advances, the fact that people are now getting their news on their handheld device rather than from a television set, as the case has been, has opened the door to an alternative to the mainstream media. In the 1960s, we had 3 networks. If it didn't happen there, it didn't happen. The destruction of Barry Goldwater was pretty easy. There were only 3 networks. They unloaded on him, and he had no forum to respond. They destroyed him. He was a madman. He was a warmonger. He was a neo-Nazi. Of course, he was none of those things. Now, because of the technological advance, people can get a broader range of news sources, whether it is Infowars.com or the Daily Caller or The Hill. You're no longer locked into the New York Times and the Washington Post and 3 networks. And I think that technological development essentially broke the monopoly stranglehold that the mainstream media had on the dissemination of political information. Prior to this, their position had been eroding, but I think the pendulum finally swung in this election, where a majority finally are getting their political information from someplace other than the mainstream media.
What if they're getting it from places that aren't telling the truth?
Caveat emptor. Let the reader discern. I mean, CNN says things all the time that aren't true. I'll have to put on the record, I'm sure CNN would vigorously dispute that. If they'll be happy to, if they would stop attacking me by name and give me the chance to respond to that the way journalists do. You see, when Ted Cruz attacked me by name or John Podesta, a news organization would ask you to come on and give you a chance to respond. CNN did neither, so I think it further proves that they're not a news organization. They may have been at one time. The information is in the eye of the beholder. It's up to the voters to sort out what's true and what's not true. I would not seek to argue with the rights of the individual to decide what they believe.
I mean, I think that in the abstract is fine, but if you look at, you speak in rather flattering terms about InfoWars in the book. Alex Jones, who's the figure most identified with InfoWars, has among other things, suggested government involvement in September 11th, in the Newtown massacre. Is it not damaging for you to give your imprimatur, or to add to the credibility of people like
If
that?
one appears on CNN, does that mean they agree with everything Anderson Cooper has ever read or said?
Certainly not, but it doesn't it suggest that they believe they have that there's a baseline of credibility there?
First of all, let's speak to audience size.
Okay.
Okay. Between those watching InfoWars in real time on the internet and those listening to it in a 200+ radio simulcast, and those watching it on YouTube Live, those watching it on Facebook Live, and then those listening to it in podcast, for that 2 hours between 1 and 3 Eastern every weekday, I'm sorry, Alex Jones is dwarfing CNN, and Fox for that matter. So he has a very large audience. I don't agree with everything he said. I dispute the Sandy Hook stuff. He's actually never said it was a false flag, that it was a government operation. He has interviewed people who have said that. 9/11, the third building does collapse for some reason. I'm not an expert on 9/11. Somebody asked me, sign this book, say 9/11 was an inside job. No, I won't do that. I don't know that to be true. But just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean that they shouldn't have an audience. And given the size of his constituency, I think it's an important outlet. It was a particularly important outlet in the Republican primaries because a disproportionate number of conservatives and liberty-minded activists are watching it, and he has an intensely loyal audience.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of loyalty and energy is, I think, in your view, increasingly important in politics. I mean, not that it never wasn't important, but the passion of one's base is increasingly important in your opinion.
One of the great advantages that I think Donald Trump had, which the mainstream media and particularly the pollsters had a tendency to either ignore or discount, was the intensity of his support. In other words, 9 out of 10 Trump voters would tell a pollster, I'm sticking with Trump no matter what. Mm-hmm. That number was 7 out of 10 for Hillary Clinton. You still had Bernie Sanders supporters who weren't quite sure that they would stick, depending on how the campaign came out. Mm-hmm. So Trump's intensity really allowed him to bounce back after the assault on John McCain, after the, he assaulted a judge, calling him, a Mexican. Those things that might have killed a normal politician, he took maybe a 2 or 3 point hit, and then he bounced right back to where he was previously, showing the intensity of his support really gave him resilience in the race.
Sure. You've been very generous with your time. I want to just finish off with a couple of questions. Why, given that he is President of the United States, a billionaire, very successful in lots of ways, why is Donald Trump so sensitive to perceived slights?
He is very combative. He is not ever going to let somebody punch him and not punch back. It's just not his nature. I can't tell you why, but he is not a guy who is going to turn the other cheek. It's just not his nature. So it comes with the territory. It's interesting because after the election, I was being hypercritical of a particular CNN on-air personality in a conversation with him, and he said, maybe you should just let it go. Mm-hmm. So I think it's selective, but I'm not going to second guess him. It's just his nature. He's not going to take any crap. It's just not him.
And you don't think that combativeness has dangers for him as president?
If he performs on the big issues, if he manages to revitalize the economy and renegotiate these trade agreements, make progress in terms of rebuilding our infrastructure, I don't think anyone cares. Mm-hmm. If he is unsuccessful on his issue agenda, then yes, I think Americans and the media will focus on these kind of side issues.
Mm-hmm. And we began this talking about your connection to both President Nixon and President Trump. And just to sort of finish on this point, I believe this was from also a New Yorker profile, and you were talking about Richard Nixon. And you said, the reason I'm a Nixonite is because of his indestructibility and resilience. He never quit. His whole career was all built around his personal resentment of elitism. It was the poor me syndrome. John F. Kennedy's father bought him his House seat, his Senate seat, and the presidency. No one bought Nixon anything. Nixon resented that. He was very class conscious. He identified with the people who ate TV dinners, watched Lawrence Welk, and loved their country. Maybe the Lawrence Welk reference slightly dated now, but is that, generally speaking, also true of President Trump?
Yeah, I think it's true. He identifies with the middle Americans. He identifies with the so-called silent majority. He is first and foremost a patriot, and he hates seeing what's happening to this country. He hates to see us losing around the globe. He hates to see us run down. And he remembers the time when he was a boy, when this was the greatest, freest country in the world, and we didn't lose wars. We never lost a war. So I think that he is benefiting from the politics of resentment. I think that polarization actually is a positive. It's it's us versus them. They are the elites. They have been running the country nonstop for 30 years. Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, identical in virtually every way. Endless war, erosion of civil liberties, massive borrowing and spending, an immigration system that makes our neighborhoods and streets unsafe, trade agreements that are disadvantageous to the country, they're stealing our jobs, and a foreign policy that's entirely incoherent unless we are purposely trying to build up our adversaries and enemies and undercut our friends and allies, because that seems to be what we have been doing. So it's a rejection of all of that. It's a rejection of 30 years of elite opinion. And from that point of view, polarization, I think, is positive.
Well, just on very final question on that polarization, been widely noted that President Trump has entered office with the lowest approval ratings of a new president. Are the people who are opposed to him permanently opposed, can't be reached, and he can rely on his base to carry him through to what I assume you would hope would be a second term, or does he need to reach out beyond the people who are currently supporting him?
Well, first of all, the polls you refer to are the same polls that showed Hillary Clinton winning comfortably, and there are some polls that show his approval rating higher than others. I don't think he should be guided by polls. I think it's a mistake. The Clinton campaign kind of proves what happens when you're guided solely by polls. Here's a man who took no polls in his drive for the nomination, spent not a dime on polls, operated on gut instinct. No, I don't think that that everyone who opposes him today is lost to him. I think you have a lot of honest, sincere, working class people that the mainstream media has whipped into a frenzy with a false narrative about who he is and what he's going to do. No, he's not building a museum for the Ku Klux Klan. No, he is not repealing all gay marriages. These are the kind of nonsensical attacks on him that you can see all over social media. He said something during the campaign I really think is true. After about a year, people will say, wow, you're really doing a good job. I think that's what he aspires to. It's not some ideological one-size-fits-all. He wants to do the job. If he can make progress towards making America great again, he could get reelected if he chooses to run for reelection.
Once again, the book is The Making of the President, 2016, How Donald Trump Orchestrated a Revolution. Roger Stone, thank you for joining us on
Thanks
The Hill's
for having
Facebook
me.
Live.
It was great.
Right.